Hi everybody, 2020, the year that I think most of us did not enjoy so much, is finally coming to an end. So I thought, what better way to look back on the year than do a tier ranking video of all the books that I read 2020. I should say, actually, right off the bat, these are not all of the books I read in 2020. These are books that I thought would be of interest to talk about from 2020, so I didn't throw in a lot of economic books and kind of stuff that I thought would not be very interesting to most people on the channel. All fantasy books that I read are on here, as well as a selection of nonfiction, so just know that going in. You'll notice that my tier rankings are just my ratings for books, so if you have any questions about how I rank books or recommend them, there's a video link in the description below. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but it's not exactly like an, S tier A, B, C, D. And I also did not rate all of these before I came up with this rating system. So if you have any questions on that, check the rating system or my reviews, particularly these books. And of course, on most of these, there are long form reviews, so I'm going to try to be as brief as possible and spoiler free. So obviously you don't have to have read all of the exact books I've read to watch this video. That would be crazy. Also, there's literally no order to this list. I just kind of put this out there. So anyway, let's see how this goes. First off, a very interesting one, that is A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. So this is a nonfiction work, a work of history, specifically of the United States, obviously, and it focuses on telling the story from people groups and societal groups that have been, for the most part, ignored, downplayed, or oppressed in the history of the United States. So especially there's a focus on the Black experience in the United States, as well as the Indigenous peoples' experience of history in North America, especially the history of the United States, which obviously doesn't start until about 1787. Right off the bat, this is an all-time great. This is a fantastic work. Even if you don't really like history, I would recommend starting here. Not just because it is very important and the information is good, but Zinn himself is a very good storyteller from history, thoughtful. It's not bogged down in excruciating detail, but also isn't skimming history. It's really in-depth, really well done, and eye-opening. Highly recommend it, especially if you're looking to get into nonfiction. It's a good place to start. It's thick, but also each chapter can sort of be read as a little essay or short story. You can take it as you want and take your time with it. So I would really highly recommend Zinn if you have not taken him yet or read him yet. Graphic novel is up next, All-Star Superman by Grant Morrison. My favorite Superman story, especially if you haven't read Superman before, or as I said in a video, if you think Superman is boring and not, like a good superhero like Batman or Spider-Man. I like both of those superheroes, but Superman is maligned, I think, because he's hard to write, but when he's written well, it's great. So I would strongly recommend reading Superman, All-Star Superman. I'm going to put that in the universal recommend. It's really, really good. Anne of Green Gables. I just came out with a rave review on this. I read this because I had Victoria from A Musical Bookworm as my Secret Santa pick for our booktube Secret Santa, and so I read it because it's one of her favorites, and it's an incredible book. It was touching in every single way. L.M. Montgomery is an amazing author and wordsmith and just wizard with the word, and just I cannot recommend the joy that this book caused me enough. Read Anne of Green Gables, whether you're man, woman, non-binary, child, adults, whatever. You should read Anne of Green Gables. It's a short, easy, fun read. Same is true for Anne of Avonlea. Again, this is gonna go in an all-time great. Just a delightful book. So much fun, introduced to a couple new characters in Anne's life. It just continues this whole feel. The whole Anne of Green Gables books so far, I've only read these two, they just feel like one continuous whole rather than different books. So good. Black Company by Glenn Cook. Now this is a very interesting one because, and as I said that, I'm probably gonna have to do a long endorsement because I have to talk about it a little bit here before I really give my final thoughts. It's an interesting book because it's so influential on focusing stories more on the ground especially in military fantasy and grimdark, whatever that means, stories, giving limited information to the reader even while crazy shit is happening in the world around us. But I will say that the writing style is difficult because it's just odd. It's very staccato, it's very smushed, for lack of a better way, and because there's that lack of information, it takes a little while to get used to the cadence. By the end, I was enjoying myself, never to the point where I thought it was an all-time great, but I could definitely see why this was so influential. And did I put Shadows Linger on here? Shadows Linger is yeah, I did. Okay, so we'll get to this later. It's the second book in the Black Company. Well, might as well do it now. Let's do this. So Shadows Linger right here. I'm going to put right now at Universal Recommend. It's better. The chapters are shorter, you're used to the rhythm of the story, and it's more localized. Black Company is just like all over this continent and world. Shadows Linger is like in one city, basically. So I like it better, and I think it's more accessible. Black Company is good, but not accessible, which is why it gets in the long endorsement. But Glenn Cook's Black Company, I think, needs to be talked about more than it is on BookTube. We are at our first Malazan Book of the Fallen. I've said a lot about these. You guys know I love them. This is the Bone Hunters, which is the 6th in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Definitely an all-time great. One of the best in the series and one of the best books, fantasy books of all time. We can just keep going there. Caliban's War is the second book in the Expanse series by James S.A. Corey, which is actually 2 authors, a pen name for 2 authors. I've really been enjoying this series more than I thought. It's a great pickup and enjoy. I think I'm going to put this right now at Universal Recommend. I think they're just a blast. It's a space opera, but not like Star Wars and not really like Star Trek. It's sort of in the middle. It's more contemporary. It's its own thing, but has sort of the fun adventure elements of both of those. Since we're not talking spoilers, I'm not going to talk differently about the 2 of them. So let's see. I think Leviathan Wakes is somewhere in here as well. Yep, there it is. That's also going to be a Universal Recommend. Just a fun book. I would highly recommend The Expanse. I'm really excited to keep going in this series. I think it has a chance to really be one of my favorites if it continues to tell this story as good as it is telling it. The Story of Crazy Horse, or The Spirit of Crazy Horse. I can't quite remember the exact name of it. It is a oral history of Crazy Horse, who is a Lakota chief and war leader and spiritual leader in the late 1800s. This is a tragic but important tale, and what I love is it's an own voices story from a Lakota tribesman who is telling the tragic and yet inspiring tale of Crazy Horse's life. I strongly suggest this, especially if you're looking to get Indigenous people's history from their own eyes and their own understandings. I think it really communicates the sadness and hope that is mixed up in the history of these brave people, Would highly recommend picking that up if you haven't. Stephen Erickson's Dust of Dreams. Guess where I'm putting this? That's right, best of all time. Again, Malazan, all of them are amazing. You know what I feel about this. Edge Dancer, long endorsement. It's a fun, if you like Stormlight Archive, I think you're going to like Edge Dancer. I like it because it's a little bit more in sort of a YA/silly/lighter tone, which I think Sanderson does really well. And so I really enjoyed that. Pancakes, etc. If you read it, you know. It's fun. FDR. I wanted to put a little representation of my historical reading because I love nonfiction historical, especially historical biographies. FDR is one of my favorite presidents. Complicated man, and his achievements and how he went about it, and a lot of things to talk about there, but this is my favorite biography I've read of him. I've only read 2 or 3, so that's not like saying a ton. But really well done. I put long endorsement just because it is a long book and it is very detailed. I mentioned here with Zinn that he is a good storyteller, not like a historian. The writer of FDR, and I'm blanking on her name, or his name, I can't remember who it was, is very historically minded. I enjoy that, but I understand that not everyone will. It's also very long. So, long endorsement there. Let's go to Grave Peril, which is Jim Butcher's third book in the Dresden Files. I thought it was quite good, but still sort of a long endorsement. I'd say it's good. There's some hiccups, and if you don't really like fantasy, or well, if you don't like fantasy, you probably won't like it. If you don't like mystery elements, which I'm not a huge fan of, might not be your favorite. I really enjoyed it, but I wouldn't like jump out of my chair to endorse it to somebody. That's true of the first 3 books in this. Stormfront, I'm going to put there. And then actually, I think I read one more, right? What's the second one? I might have forgotten to put it on here, honestly. What's the second one of the series called? Full Moon! Full Moon. I don't think it's on here. I must not have put it anywhere. That would actually go the if you would like X. It's just like whatever. If you like Dresden, you're going to be fine with that one, and you should read it to get through, and it establishes some stuff in the world, but overall, yeah, not really my thing. So I'm going to talk about Summer Night in a minute. How Not to Be an Anti-Racist. I would universally recommend this. This is a quick, short, Ibram X. Kendi is the author. It's a short, quick primer on some of the aspects of racism and how we can understand it and discuss and bring about change from it. It's not a perfect work. There's a lot of internal dialogue in this sphere about what an anti-racist is, whether his presentation of critical race theory is robust enough. This is probably too technical, but I think it is a great primer, especially if you haven't heard any of these ideas before, to start out here. It's a book that is very good on giving you exact definitions of what is being talked about, which is not always the case. So very helpful. I would recommend that for people for sure. An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. I'm going to give this a long endorsement. So obviously this book is purposefully sort of in the tradition of a people's history of the United States. Right off the bat, it is not as well written as A People's History of the United States, but it does give a really harsh, and it's much shorter, but a harsh treatment of particularly the treatment of the indigenous peoples of North America and how they have suffered under the United States. I think the writing is not as good, it's not as crisp as Zinn, and it's not as all-encompassing or even as like inspiring. It's more sort of a wealth of good information, I should say. So that's why it's long endorsement instead of higher, but I always want to recommend people to learn more about the indigenous peoples of the United States, how we've treated them in the past so we can treat them better in our future. Robin Hobb's The Mad Ship. You guys have seen my rave reviews. Please read Live Ship Trader's trilogy, even if you've never read Robin Hobb, even if you like read Farseer and weren't a huge fan of it. It is one of the most incredible series I have ever read in my life. All 3 of these books are going to be all-time greats. So let's see, Ship of Destiny, that's the third one. Mad Ship is the second one. The first one is Ship of Magic, which is right here. These are incredible works. I've been so spoiled this year with great books if I have that many all-time greats, but it's the truth. Live Ship Traders, I just had one of my friends, Leslie Smith, pick it up, and she also said, just incredible. Not enough people talk about it. Definitely check it out. Speaking of all-time greats, of course, we have another Erickson book. This is, I think, Midnight Tides, which I read way back in February. Definitely an all-time great. Malazan, duh. Here we go, Oathbringer. I was not a huge fan of this one at all. If you like X is where Oathbringer is going to go. It was long, it was plotting, it did what I really don't like, and even Erickson has, or not Erickson, Sanderson has poked fun at times, which is sequels of successful stories get longer and more meandering and not as good as the original ones as series get more successful, and I think Oathbringer was exactly like that. I didn't like a lot of the aspects. I still don't think Erickson does a good job with exploring prejudice in a world and like stand-ins for racism that are somewhat loose. Yeah, I just thought it was long and boring, and I was really finding it difficult. And in fact, eventually I stopped reading Rhythm of War because I had just been so exhausted, I think primarily from reading Oathbringer, so not a huge fan of that. The Other America by, I think, Michael Harrington is his name. This is an old work, first published, I think, in the late 1950s, and then republished with new chapters in like the 60s and then in the 70s, and then early on in the Reagan era in the 80s. It's just about poverty in the United States. It is a tragic read because so much of what Harrington sees and recommends in society is the same as it has been since the 50s, since the 60s, like how the oppressed are doing. And he tells the story of the oppressed from their perspective, the poor, particularly, that area of the oppressed, economically. And in various areas of the country, like how the urban poor and the rural poor are stuck in the same systems and are treated differently, but are both mistreated in many ways by corporations, by people. And he's highly involved in Congress and the acts of Congress. And so for American citizens particularly, I think it's really helpful to see how we have failed, how some government things have succeeded, and how politics, in the pure sense of the term, can be both blessing and curse. I strongly recommend this to anyone because I think poverty is something that shouldn't exist, but does because of our sort of selfish gene, our being humanities and citizens of the United States. I think that's something we can do about it, and this is a good place to start reading and figuring out what you can do. It's only about 200 pages. It's a short read. Read it. The Other America, Michael Harrington. Pawn of Prophecy by David Eddings. This is the first book in the Bulgariad. It is classic fantasy to a T, and I am going to say to a fault. It is a pretty typical chosen one, unknown chosen one, and sword and sorcery, and there's some good parts in it. I finished this book and had a good time, but I just could not move on to the second one. It didn't grab me enough. A lot of names, a lot of things going on. I am going to say Pawn of Prophecy is a if you like X book for me. If you like that classic, just storytelling, it's really well written. David Eddings is a good author, but that is not really elevated. It's just classic fantasy. If you like that, you will like the Bulgariad. I was not a huge fan. Promise of Blood. Promise of Blood is an interesting conundrum. In a way, Brian McClellan, which is the author, is a Sanderson light. He does cool magic systems and relies on that pretty heavily for its like cool factor, and is a very basic writer as far as his prose and how things are presented. And there's like 3 or 4 main protagonists, and you just follow them through the action. So in some ways that's good because people like Brandon Sanderson, so it's good to emulate him. And in some ways I think it is not very elevated. The one thing I will say is I know there's not a lot of flintlock fantasy or gunpowder fantasy, and I think this does it really well and very fun. So I'm just gonna say I'm kind of going back and forth between like if you like and long endorsement. I started the second one and still am enjoying it, so I think long endorsement is a good spot to put it in. A solid sort of 3 stars. It's an enjoyable read, and the series is very interesting. The whole idea is that there are gunpowder mages that literally like snort or eat gunpowder, and that gives them power and focus and allows them to shoot guns with incredible accuracy, because of course this is during like the Victorian era where, you know, pistols are not super accurate, but they make them very accurate. And then there's another system called the Privileged who use magic, and then there's a big mystery surrounding the gods, if they're real, and how they are going to interact in this world, especially now that a coup is happening, and the whole book starts off with a coup. I should say that my favorite part about Promise of Blood so far is the allusions to the French Revolution, which is one of my favorite periods in history, particularly to Louis XVI and Louis XIV, the Sun King, Versailles, a couple other fun things. So in that sense, I enjoyed Promise of Blood from a historical perspective, even if maybe on a narrative one I didn't love it. There it is. Promise of Blood, long endorsement. I talked about it for a long time. Reaper's Gale, it's a Malazan book. It's going up there. You guys know how I feel about Malazan, so I'm going to keep going here. This is fun to talk about. Summer Night. So far, all the Dresden Files has been in this long endorsement category. Summer Night, let's just go. It's going to go in the universal recommendation right now. Full disclosure, I haven't finished it at time of recording. I have about 100 pages left, but even if the ending sucks, which I don't think it will, The ride that this has gone through has been so great. I finally see here in this 4th book why people elevate the Dresden Files. Just a fun ride. The world has opened up. It never ceases. It's a downward, momentum drive as soon as we got going. So fun. And the character of Dresden is getting more interesting, and you can already see that he is growing and learning from some of the mistakes that made him an annoying character in the first 3 books. So really like Summer Night. If this is what Dresden Files is going to be, I am definitely going to get into this series in a harder way than even I have been to this point. So Summer Night, very, very good. Happy I read it. Sword of Kaigen. This is another book that sort of straddles the fence of long endorsement and universal recommend. And for a different reason, but I'm going to push it up to universal recommend. This is really a book of extremes. Extreme good, and then a couple things that are very, very sloppily done, especially as I get further away from it. But I think just the good far outweighs the bad, which is why I put it in the universal recommend. What M.L. Wong does well, the author's name here. Incredible characters, unique story structure, great action without being overwhelming, unique world, and fun plot. That is a great recipe. When I say that, it's obviously, yes, love it. 2 things that are clunky are some of the ways she world builds, particularly one grievous example in the beginning where it's a history lesson. She's trying to establish the world, and literally it's 4 to 5 pages of italicized history lecture that this student is sitting in on to try to tell us and bring us up to speed. There should be a better way to do that. There is a better way to do that. That was very, just off-putting, especially early on in the book. And then the final chapter in the book, unfortunately, really works to connect the story that was told in Sword of Kaigen, which is a one-off novel, into this wider world and wider series that Wong is working on or was working on. And it really takes away from Sword of Kaigen because it's the ending. And she had stuck so much of the story of that book in particular, but to try to then spin it out into other things was just a bummer. In some ways, it's kind of like the end credit scenes in Marvel movies, but if that's if those 5 or 6 of those were sprinkled throughout the final act, that would get annoying, you can see, and distracting. So that was a bummer. I would still highly recommend people check out Sword of Kaigen because it's great. Steven Erickson's finale to the Malazan book, The Crippled God, of course, is going to go up here on All-Time Great. It's the best Malazan book, my favorite fantasy book of all time. The Last Wish. Again, I've been so privileged this year. I thought this book was phenomenal. This is the first book in the Witcher series. A great, unique narrative structure and how things are told, introducing us to a great character of Geralt, a very unique world with complex politics, but we're not introduced to those politics as clearly as we are used to in fantasy. We just know enough from Geralt's perspective what he needs and what he knows. So that's great. I love a lot of the themes involved here. It's an all-time great for me. I'm super interested to move on because a lot of people say the early works that have a lot of shorter stories intertwined with longer stories are the best. So I've read one of the best in The Last Wish, and as they get longer into traditional novel formats, people don't like them as much. We'll see. But so far, I love The Last Wish, and I'm excited to read more of The Witcher. All right, let's see here. These Truths. This is another History of the United States that I read this year. This is going to go into the Universal Recommend. It's not quite as good as A People's History, but it is a very, very good work. What Jill Lepore, the author, does is particularly take the phrase from the preamble of the Constitution, "We hold these truths to be that's not from the preamble. That's from the Declaration of Independence. By Thomas Jefferson. "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among those are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Lepore takes these truths and challenges it, reviewing the history of the United States. That it has never been true that we actually hold to these truths because we've always oppressed indigenous peoples, slaves, people from the Indies, people from Mexico, people from the Philippines, and all along, poor people. Many people, immigrants, blah, 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 have been misused, and we don't really believe that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights. And so she goes through all of this in both a challenging way, but also in a very informative way. She's a great writer. In history texts, whenever you find someone who's a real great writer, Edmund Morris is another one, and you read their books, it's just like a shining light. So I would highly recommend these truths, especially if you're wanting some more of those all-encompassing histories. I loved reading A People's History and these truths back to back, and comparing how they deal with different things and what they choose to present not. Really, really great. Toll the Hounds, all-time great. Come on, it's a Malazan book. My second favorite Malazan book, and thus my second favorite fantasy book of all time. So good. It's the longest one. It's about 1,300 pages, but fantastic. Now, I didn't plan this, but the final here are 2 Stormlight Archive books. The Way of Kings, to me, is a very good, interesting book, but I'm very frustrated by the character of Shallan and who she is at the beginning, even though I enjoy where she goes in this next book, Words of Radiance. In Way of Kings, I find her storyline a little lagging. I love Kaladin's storyline. I think that's great. And Dalinar is like, okay. So overall, very interesting, and I like the world that he's building. Like, the details of it are very fun. But some of the drawbacks that I always have to Sanderson are definitely noticeable here, especially his info dumpiness. I don't know a better way to say that, especially when he's world building, and especially breaking character to do that. That sort of gets on my nerves, the way that he writes that. I also don't like how he deals with light eyes versus dark eyes, which is a big part of this first book because it's a big part of Kaladin's storyline. A lot of people, when I said that on my review, was like, oh, just wait, they'll deal with that. And they never really do deal with that. And that makes me... People saying that they deal with it later actually confirms for me that my objection is good. Because if they think that the things that are wrong with Way of Kings are solved in Words of Radiance or Oathbringer, shows me they don't really recognize the problem with the Light Eyes, Dark Eyes structure. So, long endorsement there. I think it's a great book. There's just some problems there. Words of Radiance, on the other hand, I really enjoy. I think a lot of the negatives that I just mentioned are not as prevalent in this book, and the story is so interesting. There's so many good jumps. I still think the Light Eyes, Dark Eyes thing is not done super well, but a lot of the other things are so good that I'm going to pop it up to Universal Recommend. I definitely think it is the best of the Stormlight Archive, and I really had a blast reading it, and at the end, it really made me excited to read Oathbringer, which is the I hadn't read. Obviously, you can see how that turned out here. But there we go. That is my 2020 tier ranking video. Very interesting. All-time great has the most, and then Universal Recommend has the most, then long endorsement, and then only a couple if you like X. So it's been a great reading year. I love seeing this. Maybe this means that I need to take more risks in reading. We'll see. But overall, I'm really happy with my year in reading, especially towards the end. A lot of these I've read at the end, and of course I read two of my now favorite series of all time, between Live Ship Traders and Malazan in 2020. So it's a rough year for most of the world, but for my reading life, it was great. Let me know what you think of any of these books, how you think my 2020 was in the comments below. Like and subscribe, of course. I do have a Patreon if you want to support me in the channel. As always, first in, last out.